Welcome to the Nikon Z6III Complete Camera Guide. My name is John Gringo, and in this course we're going to be going through everything that the Z6III can do. We're going to be going through all its features, all its operations. If you want to be an expert in how to use this camera, that's what we're going to be focusing on in this class. Now the Z6III, I believe, is a very, very important camera to Nikon. Yes, the Z8 and some of the higher end cameras take a little bit of the limelight, but this is what most of the people use who shoot Nikon. I know the other ones are very popular, but this hits that kind of peak bell curve crowd, not the high end, not the low end, right in the middle, and this camera is very important. This is a camera that I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of great pictures from because it is a well-built camera with lots of great features, and we're going to be going through all of them in this class. So let me tell you what we're going to be doing in here. I've broken the class down into a lot of very distinct sections so that we can cover each topic very thoroughly as we go through it. And it's going to go on for a little bit because we want to really get in depth on each of the different topics. So we're going to start off with a few basics for people who might be new to photography, but we will cover some important, more advanced topics in there as well. Then we're going to get into the more serious sections. Exposure controls goes through everything that you need to know about for getting the right exposure. We have another equally important one on all the different focusing controls. We then look at the capture controls. Now this was formerly called drive settings, but now we have new capture controls. We'll take a tour of the camera and look at all the buttons and dials and the various operations. We'll look at all the customization that you can do of the viewfinder and monitor. There is a shortcut menu called the I menu. We'll show you what's in there and how to customize it. There is a whole section on video shooting. There's a lot of controls that are very different when you do that. We'll look at all the devices that you can hook up to the camera and some of the parameters with those. We'll take a quick look at some of the available lenses, give you a few ideas about some good options there. And then the next several sections are going to be going through the camera menu system in very close detail. And then finally, I have my field setup guide, which is how I would set the camera up for a variety of shooting scenarios and some final thoughts on operating the camera. So by the time we're done with this, you're going to have a very, very complete idea on how to operate this camera, how to get the most out of it, and how to get it customized for what you want to do. Now, as we go through this class, I'm going to be referring to settings in the menu system that we'll be talking about more later on, but I know some of you are a little bit more advanced or you just like to jump ahead. And if you want to go ahead and jump ahead, well, I'm going to give you a menu reference box that you can look at on screen and know exactly where to go in the menu system to make the change that I am talking about. Now, as we get to the later stages of the class, I might be referring back to earlier sections of the class where I more fully explained a particular topic. I try not to explain myself twice in this class, and so if I need to talk about a particular topic twice, I usually do the more thorough discussing of it earlier on in the class. Now, of course, as you might guess, this class is about the Nikon Z6III. Composition, lighting, exposure, there's all sorts of other very important topics in order to take great photographs. And this class is going to be really focusing on the operation of this particular camera and how you use this camera to achieve those results. And so this is not the only course you might need for taking better photographs, but that is definitely the primary focus of what we're going to be doing in this class. Now, my particular bent on teaching is I want to teach you how to get the highest quality images and how to manually operate all the features of the camera. There are many different automated operations on the camera, and we will cover those at least basically, but we're not going to be spending enormous amounts of time on that. I want to show you how to control every aspect of this camera so that you can choose to put it in automatic, or if you want to put it in manual, you'll know how to use it. And finally, I don't know if you know this, but I don't know how much you know and don't know about things. And so I tend to be a little bit more thorough in my education. So if you have a lot of experience, I'm going to talk about basics of shutter speeds for just a little bit of time, just to make sure everybody's up to speed. And so I will be explaining some basic things, but I will of course be going into the more in-depth things as well. I'm trying to make this class available to the widest swath of people possible. Now, getting to know your camera, you can also look at the reference guide, which will be valuable beyond this class. I am trying to pull out everything that is really important and putting it in this class. If I've done my job well, for most people, you probably won't need to go into the reference guide unless you're really looking for some more technical information or detailed specifications on something. So the real instruction manual is called the reference guide. Now, there is also something called a user's manual, which is more just a quick startup guide. It doesn't really have nearly as much information. It's the reference guide. And so if you're downloading a PDF online, you might see a couple of different documents in there. It's the reference guide that's the good one. There's also a guide for N-Log video. And so if you're shooting video, want to know more about the N-Log specifications and the way it works, there's going to be a separate guide for that. And so I am trying to cover 99% of what this camera does for the 99% of the typical users out there. There's always going to be reasons why you might need to go into that reference guide for a little bit more information. So don't quite throw it away yet. Always like to start with a little bit of Nikon history for those of you who are new to Nikon. They've been around for a long time. They started specializing in lenses, and then they went on to rangefinder cameras. And one of the things that happened in 1950, which seems kind of weird, is to be listing on their history, but there was an article written about them in the New York Times. And back in the day, in 1950, this was a really big deal because there was some very serious professional, renowned photographers that said Nikon was as good as these other German brands out there. And this was kind of a revolution to a lot of people. At the time, Japan was not known for making high quality electronics. And this really changed the mindset and really helped propel Nikon to where it is today in some ways. And so Nikon, not long after, came out with their SLR system. And so this is what's dominated for many, many decades. They advanced it with autofocus. They tried some different film formats. They got into digital. They tried a mirrorless digital camera that was just kind of testing the waters with a small sensor. And then they finally came to the full-frame mirrorless system that we're going to be talking about today, the Z mount system. And that was in 2018. 1 year later, they came out with a cropped frame version of it. And so that's kind of the brief history of where Nikon has been making their products. They've been known as a fantastic camera and lens manufacturer for a very long period of time. Now, the Nikon system as it stands today is mostly focused on mirrorless cameras and predominantly full-frame mirrorless cameras, which is exactly where this camera fits squarely in the middle of. There's some cameras that are a little bit higher than this in the price scale and feature set, and some on the lower end as well. Now, they do make a cropped frame version of these mirrorless cameras, and there's a few models of those available as well. It's definitely shifted more towards full frame in these later years. Now, back in the early days of digital, the sensors were very expensive, and there was a lot more crop frame cameras that Nikon was selling, and so now they're focusing more on the full frame. Now, technically, they still have their DSLRs available, although I don't think that they have made any new cameras or lenses for several years at this point, but they're still supported. I don't know if they're making them or if they're just selling what's on the shelves, but they are still available from real retailers and from Nikon themselves, but they are slowly disappearing. Now, when it comes to the mirrorless cameras, they both use a Z mount system, which means they can use the Z lenses, but Nikon also makes some specially designated Z DX lenses, which have a smaller image circle designed for the smaller sensor on the DX smaller crop frame cameras that Nikon makes. But most of their focus, as I say, is on their full-frame mirrorless, which is where we are with the Z6III. Now, in the instruction manual, or the user's guide as they call it, there is lots of different warnings, and I'm not going to go through all of them. It's kind of the obvious stuff. You don't want to mishandle a camera. It is designed to be a portable device that's used indoors, outdoors, carried around, traveled with, but it is not designed to be dropped or to go underwater, so they do say keep it dry. They'll have a lot of strange warnings in there. One of my favorite is do not use while walking. And so I'll let that be up to the individual user to see how well they can walk and shoot photos at the same time. The camera is very well made. It is made out of a magnesium alloy, with something called a Cibro P-Series carbon fiber body, which is fancy plastics, if you will. I know that might be cheapening it up, but it's actually a very well-built camera body that's going to be designed for a very long life. Like most cameras, it's not going to do well if you drop it a fair distance onto a hard surface. So you want to really avoid doing that. Now, specifically on the weather sealing, I'm a little confused on this one. I will tell you what Nikon says, and then I'll give you my thoughts on it. So they have said that this has the same level of dust and drip resistance as the Z8. And they said when the Z8 came out that it had the same level as the Z9, which was their top-of-the-line camera when it came out. I'm really suspicious as to whether this has the same sealing as a standard professional level Nikon camera. That doesn't seem right, but that's kind of what they're implying. But my recommended usage of the camera really doesn't change. If there's a light rain and there's a few drips that are getting on the water on the camera, that's not a big deal in my opinion. If you're going out in the rain to shoot for a prolonged period of time, I can virtually guarantee you that's going to be a problem. If you're going to go shoot some sporting event, you're going to be out in the rain for an hour and it's really coming down, you want to have a rain cover for something like that. And so for light little mistings or short rain, we're talking about 5 or 10 minutes of a modest rain that wouldn't bother you too much without an umbrella or a rainproof jacket or something like that. That's when you're probably going to be okay. The shutter life on this is quite good. It's rated at 200,000 cycles. I was going through some old information from some older cameras, and the professional cameras back from 20 or 30 years ago, they were rated to 100,000 in their cycle life. And so they've developed more durable mechanisms in the shutter system as time has come along, and so 200,000 should be a good long life. It doesn't mean that your camera comes to an end when you shoot 200,000 photos. It's just that's how long it's typically rated to last. All right, next up, let's make sure our camera, your camera, my camera is ready for this course. You will need a charged battery in there because you're going to want to practice around, playing around with the focus and exposure controls. You're going to need a lens on the camera. If you don't have a lens on there, you're not going to be able to access all the things in the menu system. Most of them, but not everything in there. You'll need at least one memory card in the camera. We use SD as well as XQD or CF Express Type B cards. And so at least one card. You can put both in there if you want. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on in the class. We'll turn the camera on. Make sure your lens is set to autofocus. Now this may be done on the lens itself, or you may need to do it in the camera. Depends on what type of lens you have on the camera. We're going to set the camera to the program, the full auto mode, and then we're going to go ahead and press down on the shutter release. And so I'm going to get my camera set up, and so let me get it set here. I'm going to turn the camera on right here. I'm going to rotate the dial. Now it does have a locking pin, and so I need to press that in as I get it around to the full auto mode right there. Now over on the lens, this particular lens has a and M switch, and this is for focus, manual focus and autofocus. And so I'm going to make sure it's in autofocus. And so that way when I press down on the shutter release, it's going to focus in on the subject, and if all's right, yep, we hear a click. So my camera's working out fine. Sometimes people need to go get a memory card or charge their battery, and this is a good time for you to get that done so that you're ready for the remainder of the class. All right, one of the things I want to check on real quickly before we get into anything too serious in this class is the firmware that is operating the camera. Now, firmware is the software that runs all the operations on the camera, and like with any other computer or other device that has software, occasionally there's bugs and or improvements that get made along the way, and cameras are no different. Now, the only thing that's a bit of a challenge here is that your camera is not hooked up to the internet, so you're going to have to go through just a little bit more work when you want to update the firmware. So the firmware that I am recording this original class with is firmware version 1.02. And you can find this by looking in the camera menu system. So let me go ahead and show you where that is on my camera and prove to you that this is the firmware that I'm using. So I'm going to hit the menu button down here in the bottom right. And I'm going to use this left-right controller to go over to the left side so I can tab down to the wrench icon. I'm going to come to the right And then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. You can see the scroll bar over on the right-hand side. And down here at the very end is firmware version. I'm going to go to the right with that controller. And you can see that the C setting over on the left says 1.02. And that is the firmware running in the camera. In case you're interested, the LF is lens firmware. And so there's also firmware for lenses that get updated. It isn't as frequent and it isn't quite as big a deal. It's always good to have the latest version for the camera or the lens. And so it's undoubtable that Nikon will likely come out with some sort of new bug fix or added feature or performance enhancement, and they're going to come out with a new firmware. And so if they do, and it's significant, well, I might record a little updated video to share with you what's new about it if it's significant enough. If they fix a word in a foreign language, I'm not going to do an update video on that. If they add a whole bunch of new features, yeah, I'd probably add a new video for something like that. So there's a QR code on screen, and you can scan that, and that'll take you to the shop page, my shop page, where this class is housed. And you can take a look at the sections and see if there is a firmware update section listed with the class. And so at this time, there isn't, because I am doing this with the most current software. So that would be something for you future viewers somewhere down the road where there is an update to it. Now, if you do want to do a firmware update, if there is one available, or you're at 1.00, go to Nikon's website, download the appropriate software, put it on a memory card, put the memory card in the camera, come to the spot that I just showed you where firmware is in the menu system, and it's going to ask you to update the firmware. And this will usually take 5 minutes or so, so you want to have a charged battery. Now, best practice on this is to format a memory card before you put the firmware on it, and then after you're done loading up the firmware, reformat that card again before you start shooting on it. There's just a potential that it could cause a communication error. It's kind of a funny file type that is not normally on the card that the camera works with. It's two different ways that the camera works with memory cards. And so I think that's just a good practice for anyone. All right, so I'm going to be working with my camera here as it comes out of the factory box with its factory reset standard settings. And some of you will have played around with your cameras and you might be thinking, okay, this is a good time for a fresh restart on everything on the camera because we're going to be learning everything about it. And if you would like to reset your camera, well, you can do so. I'm going to do mine right now. Now, however, if some of you like the way that you've set up your camera, you've made changes, you know that it's right for you, you don't need to reset to watch this class or follow along with it at all. But this is just for those of you who would like to reset your cameras. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go into the menu system, and it's actually right next to where our firmware version is. If you'll notice, we're in the wrench setting. We go to the right and we want to come up to reset all settings. We'll go to the right, and I'm going to go ahead and press OK. And I'm going to confirm this by pressing yes. And it's going to go through a bit of a reset, and then it's going to tell us to turn the camera off to complete the reset process. And now our camera is back to the factory default settings. And so we'll be doing this class from the ground up, base level of everything that we need. All right, folks, there you go. That's the introduction section to this class. We've got a lot to get to in future sections.